Depending on who you are, that sound is either the most soothing or most intimidating sound in all of Monster Hunter. The underwater mechanic in the third generation is incredibly divisive. You're either a fan of it or you just downright hate the stuff. Quite honestly, I'm probably the biggest advocate for underwater combat there probably is. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the underwater combat in the third generation and why it means so much to me and why I feel like even though you don't like it, you should totally give it another chance. So up until this point, whenever you fight a monster, you fought him on land. There was Plesioth, and I believe the first, second generation, where you had to fish him out a little bit, and it led you to think that, yo, how cool would it be if I actually was able to jump in there and do the fisticuffs myself underwater? And in the third generation, we finally got to do that. Now, I understand a lot of people hear me out. You think that the controls aren't as intuitive. You think your weapons are actually really, really bad underwater. This I get, but something that I actually had to learn to do was become really adept with a lot of different weapons due to Monster Hunter Tri. Now, back in Monster Hunter Tri, we didn't have the full suite of weapons that we had today. So even though I am a primary Lancer, if I ever felt the need to switch things up, I did. I pretty much played every single weapon underwater as well as above land. So I hear you there. So maybe if you can look around that, maybe pick up a weapon that's very strong underwater like hammer or longsword or greatsword. These are all very strong weapons on land and very popular weapons to this day still. Even switch axe is actually really nice underwater as well. The only true weapons that actually had any bad matchups underwater were the sword and shield and the dual blades. Also bow to be... the bow's in there a little bit, but nevertheless. So the thing is, if you really want to actually get really good at fighting monsters in the water, you had to, I guess, diversify yourself. You had to choose different weapons. You had to try out different things. I mean, I myself, like I said, I am a Lancer. I've lanced my entire life. But when fighting monsters in the water, I reached out to the longsword. I reached out to the greatsword. I still lance, you know what I mean? But in Tri, you were limited with your weapon suite, so you had to basically try everything. No pun intended. Monster Hunter Tri, you know what I'm saying? But nevertheless, so water was a little different because it made people have to adjust themselves. And to be very fair, it wasn't the most intuitive controls underwater. That much I do understand. Don't hate me, I do understand your plight. However, the adaptability as you as a player is what's really needed to actually really enjoy what water actually has to offer. So hear me out. Let's talk about water in different light. So let's say they bring water back. Water was something that was actually really fun to me. It was really immersive because like I said, we've always fought monsters on land, but the time in which we actually had to fight monsters where they themselves had the upper hand is incredibly limited even to this day. It wasn't until endgame power creep monsters like the current Gen Elatron and Fatalis made it to where it felt like we were the ones on the back foot, but in this particular case and Tri the underwater mechanics, it made monsters like the Lagiacrus, the Plesioth, the Plesioth. Let me tell you something. You're at the disadvantage fighting Plesioth no matter where you fight Plesioth. But monsters like Goldbulver or Ludroth, these monsters who didn't really work too well on land perform exceptionally well underwater. Now currently we're in the 5th generation. The 3rd generations were underwater cadets. Gosh, I don't want to keep making water puns. I want to say sea legs. I really wanted to say sea legs, and I also want to say he got his feet wet, but I didn't. We're just gonna do this. So 3rd generations were the underwater combat got his sea legs, aka his feet wet, aka the first dip in the water, the dippity dip, if you will. And since we're in the 5th generation now, I believe it is now high time to actually try to not full on throw it back into the game, or at least not in the 5th generation, maybe the 6th generation, but they should really start bringing it back around because we added verticality, parkour-esque movements and everything in the 4th generation. They perfected in the 4th, actually they introduced it in the 4th generation with Monster Hunter 4, updated a little bit more in Generations, went to town with it in World, and they're having an absolute freaking ball in Rise, you know what I mean? Like with the whole literally running up walls like ninjas and then the wire bugs and everything else. So like mobility is no longer an issue when it comes to Monster Hunter, because we all know that Monster Hunter was a very sluggish, tankish type of game up until literally the 4th generation, but they completely fixed it. They've mastered that now. So now they have to go backwards. I believe they should go backwards, go back and look at water combat and say, okay, what did we do wrong? How can we fix it? And the real question is, how are we going to adapt certain weapons who weren't there when water was a thing to how it works today? And what mechanics are we going to bring back in from the previous games that will actually coincide with what we bring in with water as it stands? The wire bugs, I honestly believe wire bugs should work underwater, simply because the wire bugs, for the most part, they're just like anchored points that you can actually get to, so you could throw the wire bug out and just zip closer or excuse me, zip faster through the water to get to a certain part. Now, the one thing that's going to be a bit tricky to actually really do is going to be mounting underwater, but then again, who's to say that you couldn't find yourself wrestling a monster underwater? I can totally see that being a thing. It's just how in which we get to point A to point B is going to be the issue. Granted, I'm not a developer or a video game designer or anything like that, so I don't exactly know how they would do it, but I feel as if the end result is something that's quite literally applicable to what we have today. So let's say they actually add underwater combat. Let's say they add another weapon. Let's say they add like an anchor or something. You know, if they're going to add underwater, they got to add something else to go with it. Make it more appealing to the player. And the thing is, what they did with the third generation was they added underwater combat, but they never ever seriously forced you to go underwater as often as a lot of people like to think they did. You only had to fight the Royal Ludroth, the Gobel, Lagiacrus, Cetus. That is it. That is 4 monsters. You don't have to fight no one else underwater. You can only go underwater 4 times if you want to. I think there were 2 other urgent key quests, but you didn't really have to do it as often. And it was only one relatively dedicated underwater map. We'll get to that. Flooded Forest, we're totally gonna get to that. Then you had the deserted island. Then you had that one thing that Cetus had all by himself. Now let's get to the Flooded Forest. The Flooded Forest is making its return in Rise. Flooded Forest is probably my favorite map of all time. And to see it come back and Rise as a slightly damp forest, you know what I mean? The teaspoon of water forest as opposed to flooded. To say trigger me is something different. That's not enough. There needs to be something more than that. But I am not a huge fan of how it's actually being reintroduced to this game. But if anything, I'm actually happy it is making a return for people who've never actually been to the Flooded Forest to actually see what it is in its majesty and its beauty. So I'm actually okay with them at least bringing it back. Granted, I'd like for them to actually bring it back in its full glory. But, you know, one hand and then the other beggars and choosers, or can't have your cake and eat it too, whatever you want to call it, that kind of thing. But the Flooded Forest, it's a beautiful map, and it's a great map that allowed us to actually be more immersed in the underwater gameplay. So when they bring it back, I say that they should keep how they had it in Try, where they didn't force you down your throat to be underwater every single time. Make it to where you only have to fight a couple of limited monsters underwater. Make it to where you didn't have multiple maps dedicated to underwater combat. Maybe 1 or 2. Bring back 3 even, you know, or if you're gonna have like a wide variety of maps, which doesn't really seem to be the case, but if they were to have a wide variety of maps, give us like 4 maybe. Give us the 2 OG ones, maybe come up with a completely different third one or something like that, or probably have different parts and others in there as well. So for instance, let's say the ancient forest in World, let's say they bring that back in that beach area, they open that up, they expand that a bit to where you can actually go around there, you know. It's just something worth looking into. Don't like put all your cake, put all your eggs in this one particular mechanic. Reintroduce it, but reintroduce it for the masses. Make it a little bit easier for everyone to actually get in there. Make the camera work better, which the camera does work a lot better now than it did before. That's 100% fact. The camera is a lot better than what it was. The intricacies with your mobility shouldn't be that much of a problem anymore, since we've pretty much mastered that mobility thing. All we have to do is slightly carry it over to what you can do in underwater. So all in all I'm getting at here is, that's essentially my plea, I guess, for underwater. This is what I feel underwater could do if underwater were to make a return. Now I'm thinking about it out loud. Since I love underwater so much, I could probably make a video that really talks about what underwater means to me, which I may. I mean, who's to say I wouldn't? We'll call it the drippity dippity dip files or something. I don't know. But nevertheless, that's just my opinion on this, guys. So what we should all walk away with this knowing is that underwater is a mechanic that is very, very divisive in the community, but it's also a mechanic that I feel adds a grand level immersion to Monster Hunter that has honestly not yet been seen since. Granted, the mobility for Monster Hunter actually made the gameplay of Monster Hunter a huge improvement, made it a lot more enjoyable to play. Now we just have to add that same mobility into the lack thereof that underwater actually had, which was the biggest hindrance and the biggest concern for a lot of people back in the day. That's a lot of that's perfect, actually. I'm actually impressed. Actually put the bow on there. That's the bow for the video. So however long this video is, you wanted that last bit, you didn't want everything else. Nevertheless, guys, this is your boy Dak908, aka the Dig Dug himself. Tell me what you think about underwater combat. Legitimately, I earnestly would like to know what you, the viewer, think about underwater combat? Have you ever taken part in underwater combat? Have you ever thought that, hey, it looks quite interesting, I've yet to try it, but I would like to try it? Do you think it's the worst thing since not sliced bread? Because sliced bread is pretty good. I don't know. Let me know what you think about underwater combat. I'm going to be in the comment section. I'm going to be replying to everybody. Nevertheless, take care, everyone. It's been your boy. Peace.